Are you trying to make yourself feel better with the illusion of control? Or can you rethink and say, well, maybe I should give developers a better experience?
Hi, you're listening to The Secure Developer. It's part of the MyDevSecOps community, a platform for developers, operators, and security people to share their views and practices on DevSecOps, Dev and Sec collaboration, cloud security, and more. Check out mydevsecops.io to join the community and find other great resources. This podcast is sponsored by Snyk. Snyk is a dev-first security company helping companies fix vulnerabilities in open source components and containers without slowing down development. To learn more, visit snyk.io. On today's episode, Guy Podjarny, president and co-founder of Snyk, talks to Erkang Zheng at DevSecOne Seattle. Erkang has 15 years of experience in cybersecurity, from identity and access, penetration testing, and incident response to data, application, and cloud security. He is passionate about combining innovation and execution to deliver practical solutions that address cybersecurity challenges at their root cause. He is currently the CISO at LifeOmic and the founder of JupiterOne.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the show. We have another DevSecOne edition of the Secure Developer Podcast, and we have another great speaker with us, Erkang Zheng from LifeOmic. Welcome to the show, Erkang.
Yeah, thank you. Great to be here.
So, Erkang, before we kind of go and dig into the talk and various other topics, tell us a little bit about yourself. What is it that you do?
Yeah, sure. So I am the CISO at LifeOmic. LifeOmic is a software company, and we build a cloud-based platform for healthcare data, for patient data, genomic data, and so on, so that we work with institutional partners, research organizations to build machine learning algorithms for things like cancer research and things like that. And at the same time, the platform also supports a set of mobile apps that we've built for direct-to-consumer, direct-to-patient interactions and track wellness behaviors and so on, right? So that enriches the platform, and then for patients' usage as well.
Got it.
So
okay,
that's what I do at LifeOmic. Run the SecOps security operations team over there. But in addition to that, I also build a security product. Maybe later on I can get to talk a little bit about that as well. It's a security product called JupiterOne, focused around kind of cloud visibility and compliance.
Excellent. Yeah, definitely need to dig into that one as well as we run. Just as a picture, so you said you run SecOps. Before we again go to the talk, what does the overall sort of security team look like?
The security team is really light, and it is purposely so. We are still a startup, so overall we're a little over 70 people, and primarily all engineers, and security team is only 3 people. Now, and that's part of the whole concept of DevSecOps, right? Is we want to have a lean security operation so that we can leverage automation, we can leverage the broader engineering team so that everybody can participate in security. So it's not just one person's job or one team's job, and we don't become the blocker of things. Right. So that's how
that's the philosophy behind the security team as well. So I guess that's probably a pretty good segue to your talk. So what is your talk about?
Yeah, actually, so my talk is about how we do DevSecOps, right? So I think DevSecOps means different things to different people. And I actually look at DevSecOps very similar to DevOps, right? So with some of the security focus to it. And so my talk is about our culture and our implementation of how we implement and enable DevSecOps, right? So essentially is how do we allow our teams to move fast with security building, right? And with assurance and confidence at the end of it, right? And that's through automation, through a lot of kind of culture aspect of things, in addition to just tools and processes.
So give us some highlights, like some of the, we're going to point people to the YouTube videos, so they're going to see the full talk later on. Give us some of the key examples.
Sure. So the highlights, I mentioned 2 aspects, right? So one is the organization and culture aspect of it. So that particular one, we actually started a security manifesto. So I think most people are very familiar with the Agile manifesto, right? So that's what really sparked DevOps. We've done something quite similar, and that is our security manifesto. We have actually posted that on securitymanifesto.net. There are 6 things in there that speaks to the way of works for modern cybersecurity in a DevOps and kind of cloud native type of way. So that's definitely one of the highlights, right? Without going into details, and that you can actually check out the video, right, or the talk to see the details. And the second aspect would be sort of the enabling aspect, right? How do you do it, right? So once you have the culture and you have the manifesto, you have everybody on board with how we're going to do it. Now, what is the actual implementation to make that work, right, is the second part of my talk. And that has to do with a lot of automation and the tools that we built, which later on became JupiterOne, right? So now within that second part, now there are further two things. Now, the way I look at DevSecOps, it really is, one, security as an enabler for DevOps. Now, this is what a lot of people were talking about, throughout the conference, shift left, right, and build security in and stuff like that, using automations, work with developers, and, as part of the CI/CD pipeline, right? So that's one aspect. And actually, a colleague of mine is giving a talk on the second day with very specific details on that, right? So the security automations in a CI/CD pipeline.
Yeah, which is the core, is that sort of second component of after you've agreed on your principles. That's right. Automate it into the system.
Exactly. And to give you a little bit background on that, right? So as small as a team that we have, engineering-wise, right, compared to the large organizations out there, we actually do anywhere between 20 to 50 production deploys every day, continuously. And not only do we do that, we have to ensure that with every production deploy and all the boxes are checked in this highly regulated, HIPAA compliant environment, right? So that talk goes into details on what we did in automating those checks and balances. So without using people, right? So without saying you have different teams, separation of duties, and all implemented by people, how do we leverage code and tools and automation to implement it so it has the same effect, or maybe even better effect, because you make less mistakes by running a kind of pre-checked set of code.
Right.
So that's one, right? And then the second part I mentioned, that was development as an enabler, or actually I should say security as an enabler for DevOps, right? So the second part of the implementation details are going to be around how do we use development as an enabler for SecOps? Right, so that's the second part of how I look at DevSecOps that a lot of people don't talk about. Now, that has to do with the day-to-day work of the security team, right? Not the day-to-day work of developers, but the day-to-day work of the security team and the compliance people. Now, how do we use development to help make their jobs better and easier, right? So that's to kind of give you a little preview of that, right? So we actually have a mechanism. We developed a platform to aggregate data from different sources and build a graph, a sort of visual graph around it to focus on the relationships of the things that we have, right? So these entities and how they are connected within this massive digital environment that an organization may have. So for us, and again, we're a startup, so we have a couple 100,000 of entities and over 1 million relationships just across our digital environment.
Yeah, they grow quickly.
Exactly. And they get complex, they get out of hand, and you kind of lose control over time. So that's the second part of our talk, is how do you solve that challenge?
Yeah, I love that because it's indeed not often discussed. So I think I've got sort of a couple of offshoots, from the topics that you mentioned. One is, you mentioned about sort of security automation as something that allows you to, stay compliant and build those security in without, hiring a horde of security people, which you probably can't hire anyway because there's a talent shortage, so that's a different problem in its own right. So you have those. What's your, you live in a very kind of regulated surrounding, right? Or at least, like you deal with patients, kind of very private data. How do you balance, or how much freedom do you give developers to go off the reservation, like to sort of, to get, like be able to choose to do things a little bit differently? You've chosen a framework, you've chosen some tools. Is the developer allowed to disobey?
That is a great question. So we actually give developers tremendous amount of freedom to do the things that they want, right? So to give you a couple of examples, right? So we don't restrict on the development frameworks or modules or libraries that developers can use. And we don't take away their controls on their local workstations. So in our case, every developer is a local admin of their own workstation. And they have the freedom to do whatever they want with it, and they have the freedom to write whatever code and bring whatever component necessary. So it sounds against security best practices, right? And I think if you haven't, you're probably going to ask, how does that work, right? From the compliance angle, we put in a lot of kind of check and balances when things actually get to production. So, for example, right, so of course, there's a lot of code analysis that goes into it. And we have automated change management process using bots, using detections, and kind of enforcing reviews of pull requests, and sort of democratizing security to all developers so that they help enforce and police their own work. Well, actually, their peers' work, right? Not just their own, right? So, for example, we have checks in place, automation checks, to ensure if your code hasn't been approved by another peer of yours and hasn't been reviewed, that's one criteria for can you or can you not go to production with that code, right? Among other things like scans for vulnerabilities. We actually use Sneak for our open source package dependencies and license checks, right? So a lot of those are covered with these automations and these tools. And even within production, I would say, the production environment is entirely kind of virtually air-gapped. I would say it's air-gapped using software in a way that there's no network connectivity into it. There's no VPN, there's no SSH. We are 100% serverless, right? So that adds a tremendous amount of kind of guardrails, right, around our production environment. And within production, those serverless functions we run from a tool called PureSec, right? So we run, integrated RASP type of protection in the functions themselves.
Got it.
So by the nature of that, right? So that allowed us to give developers a lot of freedom on their day-to-day work.
Yeah. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And I think it's kind of the brave new world. And maybe, your talk is titled, getting away from the old ways and in favor of DevSecOps. What do you think when you think about an organization, unlike, LifeOmic, who I sort of assume is more born into this philosophy?
That's right.
When you see an organization that wasn't, that has existing security practices, what are some of the key ways to move into this reality that you're describing here?
Yeah, I think any time that you want to switch from legacy is hard, right? And especially changing the processes. And I think first and foremost, you just have to embrace being uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And, at the beginning of this change, you will be uncomfortable, right? You will feel like you're losing control. But as with anything, I think the key is to focus on what truly is important, right? So going back to sort of the developer's freedom type of discussion, right, is to say, at the end of the day, as a business, you want a business to grow, to move fast, and that's why we have DevOps, right? Now, with that in mind, how do you enable that? How do you embrace that, right? So are you trying to make yourself feel better with the illusion of control, given that the manual processes and the old way of doing things that are in place? Or can you rethink and say, well, maybe I should give developers a better experience. Maybe that will help enable the business to go faster. And then on the flip side, on the security side, maybe I should just, instead of saying, I want to take control of everything, maybe I should just focus on what really matters, right? What really matters to us is the production environment, is the data there, right? Is the workload in those environments, right? So can we just focus on what really matters and then let go? Almost, this is an experience of experimenting and letting go of things, right? So I think that's part of the first step you have to take in making that organizational transition. Yeah,
it makes a lot of sense. It's a tough transition. It's sort of accepting imperfection, especially in the world of security, is hard. And yet if you try to chase everything that follows, it just doesn't scale. It's a core principle of scaling.
Yeah. And you don't have to do everything. You don't have to change your entire organization to be that way at the beginning, right? Just experiment.
Yeah, just is probably a small element, but it is akin to the change to agile.
Yep, that's right.
When organizations switch from waterfall to more of an agile methodology, that's not an easy process, but it is necessary. And I don't think anybody regrets having made it, although, many have scars from the process nonetheless.
That's right.
So tell us a little bit about JupiterOne. You built this capability in-house for your own needs, and now it's turned into a product. Give us a little bit the story.
So the idea there is to leverage code and automation to answer questions for security and compliance, right? So, because the way I look at it, and especially with a small team, with a fast-moving team, right? And I, first and foremost, do not want to run security and compliance as two separate functions. So they have to be one, right, in order to be efficient. So the question I asked myself was, now, how do I make compliance as just an outcome of running security and doing things right, rather than running compliance as its own initiative, which is what most companies do, right? So that was the question. And as I looked deeper into it, right, so I realized that, the auditors and the assessors for whatever compliance frameworks, what they do, essentially, they're asking questions to you at the time of auditing. Those are the questions that you should be asking yourself on a daily basis, right? So like, for example, hey, what are the workloads that are relevant to this production application, right? And are the data stores around these encrypted, right? So these are the compliance questions that, the auditors are asking. But these are also the security questions the teams themselves should be asking on a daily basis. So that led us to building this platform to solve actually one combined question, right? Not a separate problem, but a one combined challenge, which is, can we operate security and compliance in this sort of question-answer format, right? Can we have enough data that can provide meaningful answers and have a way that we can just ask query questions? So that's what JupiterOne is about, right? So JupiterOne, we build via API, right? This is actually only possible with cloud and APIs.
Yeah.
So we can collect this data from different sources, and we build queries, and we build a graph to connect the dots, right? Connect the resources. And then with the query language that we developed, we can then ask these questions, right? Yeah. And these questions can be set up in an automated way, right? So once you figure out what the answers are that you're looking for, what are the questions that you want to ask, then you can set these up to be repeated, right? Because they're queries, they're code. You can have them run on a daily basis, on an hourly basis, or however often that needs to happen.
Yeah. No, it sounds excellent. And also, I always like when DevOps analogies kind of work out. And once again, you talked about how developers can kind of help the SecOps side of the fence. To me, like, there's a sentence from DevOps talks about, if it moves, measure it. If it doesn't move, measure it in case it moves. And it's along those lines, that allowed for risky deployments because you could trust, or at least you were working on it, that if something went wrong in production, you will find out
exactly,
and that you'd be able to get to the bottom of why. And to do that, you had to instrument everything, and you had to do those. Right. So this sounds, from an asset inventory, from a compliance perspective, it sounds of a similar philosophy, if I understand it correctly.
Yeah, and you mentioned asset inventory. If I can touch on that real quick, because asset inventory sounds like such a basic thing, but it actually is a very challenging and tremendous amount of work to get it done right. Because a lot of people think about asset inventory as IT assets, but that's far from it, right? So if you think about everything's digital, software defined, all of those are assets.
Yep.
And that is actually a very, untapped challenge in the whole security industry, is that particular thing.
Just knowing what you have. It's about security hygiene at scale, right?
That's right.
That's the hard part.
You can protect what you can see.
Exactly. So if somebody wants to learn more about JupiterOne, do they just go to that website?
Yeah, JupiterOne.com.
JupiterOne.com. Excellent. Definitely encourage people to go check it out. Erkang, this has been a pleasure. Thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, sounds good. It's been a pleasure.
And thanks everybody for listening in. And I hope you join us for the next DevSecOn edition of the Secure Developer Podcast. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to The Secure Developer. That's all we have time for today. For additional episodes and full transcriptions, visit mydevsecops.io. If you'd like to be a guest on the show or get involved in the community, you can also find us on Twitter at mydevsecops. Don't forget to leave us a review on iTunes if you enjoyed today's episode. Bye for now.